Insights of J. Martin on our world. Society and politics. The J. Martin Interview. Welcoming J. Martin again for about the fourth, maybe fifth time during this pandemic that hasn't gone away, even though it's 3 months later. We're still technically in lockdown in England, but things have eased. But the things that you're not allowed to do would seem gobstopping. That's a silly term, isn't it? In comparison to history, for example, you can now, whilst they've relaxed, being able to meet up with your partner, if you both live alone, and therefore sex is not banned. Technically, it is with a stranger, someone you would hook up with. Although I imagine people, the level of enforcement, people would be doing that. And Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland are still quite deep in the restrictions. Wales, for example, has still got the 5-mile limit on going to see anyone in the garden, for example. So we're very much not that far out of it, really, are we? Although the case numbers on the official story are dropping to maybe several hundred, or down to, between 100 and 200 on average. So what do you think about where it all is now, then?
Well, I think it's obvious that we're in and approaching summertime, although I appreciate that there's some storms and bad weather around
that's what you get with summer anyway.
The UK.
Yes.
And as naturally tends to occur with flus and viruses, we're out of flu season. Whether or not this COVID is a seasonal virus is yet to be seen, but it does seem to be that things are beginning to abate. Whether that's due to the effective quarantine measures, certainly in the UK, that really does remain to be seen. When you compare to other countries, for example, that have really observed quarantine, lockdowns, and still continue to do so. The beaches of Spain, for example, and France and Italy are not as busy at all compared to, say, Blackpool on a sunny day.
But you should be okay if you maintain that social distance and you're staying over 2 meters away. Apparently it's been said as well that it doesn't do so well transmitting outside anyway. Should that be okay? The situation we're roughly in now in England.
Well, the way in which viruses spread, yes, you could make an argument for we should always be about 2 meters apart from each other. It's not just the coughing and the spluttering, just breathing out. Particulate matter leaves the lungs and begins either being carried in the air or falling to the ground. So you could make an argument for distancing is one way of reducing the spread of anything, I suppose.
Well, so that sounds like you could just do it all the time, just to avoid. I mean, this would be a great way of stopping the regular colds and flus, wouldn't it? Actually, but obviously now in England, non-essential shops are open again as well, and Wales is considering opening those as well. That means you can go back to places like CX, for example, or all. It's created huge queues in some places, but also it's come with this, the way that they're having to do the social distances, making people walk in a certain way, or also having regulations about not touching things in shops. It's sometimes not very practical. So what I'm wondering, what is interesting, that's happened recently is the Black Lives Matter movement has come out very suddenly, seemingly almost out of nowhere. It's changed the, should we say, what I would say is the overall left-wing consensus in some ways, from people saying, we all should be staying in more, ignoring the Conservative government's attempts to try and get everybody out again, and businesses reopening, and it's all, the deaths are still too bad. Then all of a sudden we did have this Black Lives Matter movement, and the UK took part very enthusiastically in it, and there were lots of mass gathering rallies in major cities across the UK, presumably more so in England because the restrictions are so very strict still in Wales and Scotland. I assume that people in Wales would be banned from going to places like Chester, Liverpool, and Manchester to take part. Obviously, they were trying to stress social distancing at the gatherings, but not everybody was wearing a mask, and particularly when you got more close to the front of it, it was pretty much impossible to really maintain that. So, what do you actually think about this shift towards the Black Lives Matter movement in relation to the pandemic now, and therefore the shift of what you might globally dub as the left from taking part in those protests from the stance just before everybody must stay at home and distance a lot longer than the Conservative government seem to be trying to get people to do.
Well, I think firstly it's worth pointing out before I come to that point that when faced between lockdown or centuries of oppression, I think whether or not it meant risking my own life when so many have been killed, I'd be out there and have been out supporting Black Lives Matter. And I would just make a broader point as well when it comes to Black Lives Matter, which is, in essence, we are all wage slaves. Each member of the working class. I would just further this by saying, of course, black people have suffered a great deal more than others, and I think that in terms of defending our rights, there has to be a balance between keeping secure, that is to say, stopping the spread of a virus, and also what it is that's going on. I mean, the movement started back in 2013. This isn't something that's new. In fact, you could argue the movement actually goes back to the so-called emancipation of black people in the United States, and before that, the so-called the criminalisation of slavery, even in Britain and France. Let's just be clear, even on that point. It was only back in 2015 that the UK finished paying off the slave owners for their loss of earnings at the time. Back in the early 1800s, this amounted to about 3/4 of GDP in debt. Now, I'm sorry, but we have not just a history, but things need to change. And just very briefly, just a summary of Black Lives Matter. And as I say, the movement started back in 2013.
I do remember that.
By way of the.
I do remember the first protest. So I'm just referring to that it's now just come up again suddenly when it's not been as major for a few years. But I do remember some of the ones back in the tens, the Black Lives Matter. Of course, that was a normal time, wasn't it? It wasn't a time of this pandemic. So.
Well, exactly. This was a normal time for black people who were being shot at week by week. I mean, this was the acquittal of policeman George Zimmerman for the the fatal shooting of Trayvon Martin in 2014. Shooting of Michael Brown sparked protests in Ferguson, Missouri. Black Lives Matter again led the protest as a peaceful, non-violent group, again 2015. Two fatal incidents leading to even more protest across the United States. This was the shooting of Antonio Zambrano Montes in Washington State, and Freddie Gray after being beaten while arrested, which led to further protests. I mean, this is, I agree, this is in more normal times. And we are not in normal times, and we can't return back to that normal. And if that means that people take risks with their own lives to protest, demonstrate, and say we're not going back to that, then I think that anyone listening to this should really take a good look at themselves if they think that somehow that isn't worthy.
Well, what's interesting is that it is the debate over how much, obviously it's a show of solidarity with the protesters in the United States who want to make sure, because police do seem to be able to get away with it because they can't be challenged or legally tried, and that's what's led to deaths in the situation, because you can't you can't get the police officer in trouble for something that developed. Now, now, obviously, it's solidarity with these protests, with what's being protested for in the US. Now, I did an interview at the time in the Chester one with somebody, and they said, and they think that there are things that need to be sorted in the UK as well. You're more likely to be stopped as a black person. There was an article about the coronavirus fines. It's been disproportionately more fines handed out to black people. So, I presume that you're in agreement that it's actually something, there's something wrong in the UK as well, or there's a lot of people saying that this doesn't really apply to the UK. There isn't so much of a racism issue with police in the UK, but
Of course, it applies to the UK. You're much more likely to be arrested, profiled. You're less likely to be promoted. You're less likely, you're more likely to have a wage difference between people just because of their race. And in fact, I think I'll just further this. I'm next to certain, for anyone who has read, or if you haven't, I would recommend reading it. Not my personal choice of this particular author's best bit of work, but Animal Farm by Orwell. The animals start a rebellion because they feel they're not being treated as the humans' equals, and in a very similar way, Black Lives Matter was started because they believe that police brutality and other things, African Americans, black people more broadly away from the United States, not being treated equal to white people. Both movements started with a very clear message. Small percentage of the community is a bit like Napoleon, the pig in this way, I suppose, but people wanting equality, taking it into their own hands to try and succeed. So I actually think there's quite a lot of precedents in the UK whereby people have really ignored the issue of race for too long. Let me just further this. We talk about BAME, we talk about ethnic minorities, we talk about black, and we talk about Asian. Well, just to give you some real examples of this, the amount of racist attacks that goes against the Asian community, and if you just broaden the definition with ethnic minority to those who speak different languages, actually you'll find that this xenophobic, racist attitude that has been prevailing in Britain, not everyone, and I'd like to think it's not a majority of people, but the reality is we've seen attacks on the Polish, we've seen attacks on Indian and Pakistani immigrants, we've seen direct attacks by this government on the Windrush generation, the scandal that plagued Theresa May. If we're being clear, we shouldn't say that this is an American problem. This is a British problem. And by the way, it was the Brits that literally stole people, and others, but the Brits that stole people from the continent of Africa and dropped them off, whether they survived the horrifying journey, lay next to each other in coffin-like state on slave ships, to be sold. So I'm sorry, this is a British issue.
Well, of course,
it's a global issue.
Well, that's historic, of course. Presumably we've moved on from such times, and it's presumably also it's about now. It's about changing things that are wrong now, as you say. So you're talking about that the government seems to have a racist agenda. You could just say with what's happened with the sudden desire to deport people who were from the Windrush generation. Because that hadn't happened for decades, and they just, they suddenly got the attention shone onto them by Theresa May during the time that she was Home Secretary, and then to follow that became a scandal. So I presume that the protests are aimed at that sort of thing, and also the police. But so is it particularly aimed at the government? Is it? Or is it the police as well?
Well, I don't think it's just I don't think the protest, the solidarity that's been shown is just against government or particular sections. I think this is an entire societal issue. And again, not just referring to Britain. This is global. But if if you have a look at Britain, you look at even the vote, the referendum. You know, the people who I'm not suggesting that the people who voted to leave are racists. I am suggesting that the racists voted to leave. You have found that since the referendum, Britain has become increasingly toxic. And really what it's done is it's made us look culturally at ourselves. So it's made us look at what sort of a society do we want to be. And the fact that we've had protests again around race is, for me, down to the fact that what's been exposed is this rotten undercurrent. It's not just emerged. You've got, I was reading just yesterday, you've got a woman in Scotland, I think it was, who was a dental hygienist, who's an out-and-out Nazi, as in Nazi flags at home, and lots of books pertaining to Hitlerism, and of course the inevitable books on Mosley. We've had an undercurrent in Britain of racist behaviour, and I have to say this: it is one of those issues that Britain hasn't really confronted. Nor, in fact, broadly have the working class actually considered that they are wage slaves themselves. You find that people go to work for a pittance, barely have any money to survive an entire month. Meanwhile, factory owners, business owners, corporate owners are laughing all the way to the bank. People who should be paying their tax should be, with those taxes, funding community outreach programs, funding education programs, funding interfaith, inter-community, inter-race programs. There is no money for it because we are told that this is trickled down, that the rich matter more than everyone else, and it is inevitable that this was going to come to a head. Whether it was in the United States due to the horrifying brutality of their police services, and I have to say, for those people who have heard my criticisms elsewhere of the US police and that, there were some good people who worked there, yes, I'm sure there are, but far too many of them have remained silent as their colleagues have shot, stabbed, beaten, strangled, killed, murdered.
But anyway,
because of their race,
because of the process and actually getting out on the streets, though, it has led to some changes in the culpability of people who do that in the US. So that I presume that if it was a sit-at-home process or taking the knee in individual streets and so on only, it probably wouldn't have had that sort of impact. But what's interesting about this, and what talking about anti-austerity, but of course this is about race. This is targeted on Black Lives Matter. And you're talking about the austerity issues. This process has actually been picked up by the mainstream media and applauded. So you've got, obviously that you couldn't say that's a bad thing. So, for example, Sky have a Black Lives Matter section in the in the guide. They're covering it on Sky News and Sky Documentaries. The Premier League had a Black Lives Matter banner up, and football players as they return to the football matches without any spectators actually there, but with fake crowd noise had it. And I thought that this is kind of good that the mainstream media's picked up and gone with it. But there have been 10 years of other protests such as that have largely not been covered by the mainstream media at all. For example, as you say, when talking about austerity, the alleged, perhaps not just alleged, over 100,000 people who have died from the effects of austerity and welfare cuts have not been covered mainly by the mainstream media. There might have been a couple of benefit documentaries, this is the one that they do run with. Extinction Rebellion has been covered, but it's not been taken as the actual it's been cheerleaded to the same extent by the mainstream media, although it had more coverage than all the anti-austerity protests, the ones against bedroom tax, benefit cuts, all the ones going back. And so, what do you actually think about that? That the mainstream media have actually gone with this in comparison to all the other causes that have been fought for as well.
Well, I'm no friend of most of the mainstream media. I would have to say, from my perspective, it strikes me that they are they're trying to turn this into an issue about statues.
So,
when they, we haven't seen any reports, for example, of the total bullying of Diane Abbott by some right-wing people within the Labour Party, to the point where, after racist jibes, she was in the toilets crying, and they thought it would be a good idea to send that story over to the mainstream media, who then used it to make her look incompetent. We've seen that this is now becoming which statue is taken down. Just an aside with that, I think they should all be taken down and put into a museum somewhere, and school children should go round said museum to understand why it is that they are not characters that should be celebrated, let alone adorn our street. This has become about Churchill. This has become about ministers, the foreign minister, Raab, taking a knee, had something to do with a computer game, I think is what he referred to it as. Total lack of a complete lack of real reporting for so long, and for them suddenly to come around is, there's a quote from David Lammy in 2017. So he says, clearly when someone commits a crime, they need to be punished. However, we cannot have, for one group of people, one rule and a different for another. As I found in my 2017 review of the criminal justice system, some of the difference in sentencing as a result of a trust deficit. Many BAME defendants simply do not believe the justice system will deliver less punitive treatment if they plead guilty. It's vital that all parts of the criminal justice system work hard to address these discrepancies so that the same crime leads to the same sentence, regardless of ethnicity. Now, I don't remember the press running riot against May's government, or even Johnson's government, or Cameron's for that matter. I do remember them attacking people who had been campaigning for race equality every single day. So it's what very strange bedfellows we keep in the press. I certainly don't think that they have done or actually are doing their job to their fullest ability.
So with these statues, first it was the protesters removing one, and again, it's because of the colonial past, isn't it? But what's interesting, with Labour now is that Keir Starmer supports the idea of prison sentences for damaging such statues, along with the Conservatives. So what do you think of Labour taking this position?
Just so I'm very clear, I think that is utterly abhorrent. We don't have, in my view, anymore a party. We're back to pre-Corbyn days where we don't have a party that represents Labour. The way in which the media have manipulated both Corbyn, who has been venerated by a Labour Party report, we don't have a party that represents workers. There are certainly fringe parties out there, but we don't have a mainstream one. And I don't think that the establishment figures in the media or the embedded establishment figures within Whitehall will allow workers to have a party once more. Keir Starmer is more interested, clearly, in protecting his friends and the establishment than to actually come to grips with the real anger and frustration and fear and high emotion that people are feeling just by walking down the street, that they are going to be singled out just simply due to the colour of their skin.
Which,
this has all of the flavours of the late 20s and early 30s.
So really, it's I was going to say there, yes. So it's kind of similar to what we found out about Keir Starmer, also in his reaction to the London riots as well, as he actually did support the prosecutions of people who took part in that. To sort of, that, so we've got a more centre ground Tory-like leader again, really, in Labour, because obviously, you could take a different stance on vandalism and such, but it's the severity of the establishment want to see people in jail for damaging such statues. So,
well, as someone who's studied history, I'm always reminded never to look at history through the eyes of yourself, but through the eyes of the people that you study. And in other words, there's no point in trying to apply today's morals to standards centuries ago. This said, the way that we develop as a society is understanding the bad that has occurred in the past and still does occur, and not just learning from it. Anyone who says, we need to learn lessons, isn't going to do anything, but it's to do something about it. And if that means tearing down statues of slave owners, I'm not in favour, by the way, of melting them down. I think they have lessons to teach us, and I think that those lessons translate into actions. Put them in a museum. Do what India did. Pick up all of the stone, the bronze, put them into a graveyard of statues and all of this, and get people, get kids, especially children, to go around and learn what horrifying things this. And it wasn't the working class weren't enslaving people, by the way. The working class were, as I say, wage slaves themselves. This is, again, what happens when unfettered capital, they turn people into commodities. And I would get people to go round museum trips, go and look at the statue and have a look at what each of these people did. I'm not in favour of burning and destroying our history, just as I've said many times on your programme before, as I think shutting down libraries is akin to burning books. Burning down history and pretending it didn't happen is equally just as dangerous.
I assume, though, that if you had to go to a museum to see these statues, and a lot of people wouldn't see them at all. I assume, though, that, just to cover a gap in recording, that if you had to go to a museum to see them, a lot of people wouldn't really take that much of an interest. Can't imagine, actually, that a lot of people really even know who these people are, that they see as statues as well, which is interesting. So with Winston...
That's a really good point. Sorry to just interject, but that's a really good point. Prosecuting people Edward Coulson, would we know of him if it wasn't for the tearing down of his statue?
I don't think even I'd heard of him, even though perhaps should have done. Do people
know what Churchill had done to the Indians, or for that matter, to the people of Liverpool, Glasgow, Belfast?
Well, I was going to get on to that, actually. I was going to ask you about, what if someone is saying, about Winston Churchill, perhaps the most simplified view that it would have through history is he helped Britain win World War II, and so what are some of the things that you could say to say actually Winston Churchill actually had it was actually a bit controversial his past, actually, some of the things that he did, and then you're starting to mention some of them, and what things would you say?
Well, Churchill, broadly, Churchill was a flawed character, and I think a lot of people are. He undertook attempts to flatten Liverpool, Glasgow, Belfast. He sent in the troops against striking workers. He starved quite deliberately people in India, and quite deliberately. He held deeply ingrained establishment racist views. This said, some people believe that it was him that got us through the war. I tend to think it was the people of this country that got us through the war, with the assistance of the Soviet Union and the United States of America. But there is no doubt that his speeches did help and boost morale against people who wanted to systemically wipe out people based upon creed, religion, sexual orientation, and ethnicity. It is a very difficult choice, really. There are people who feel very strongly that Churchill's deeds during the Second World War redeem him. There are other people who, for him, he's akin to looking at a statue of Hitler. I have explained what I think statues, where statues should go, and if people really feel so strongly about Churchill, there'll be no problem with them going to statue graveyards. I really do think it's time that we look at, when it comes to statues, for example, you could extend the argument to Cromwell, how offensive Cromwell is to certain swathes of the British and Irish populations. You could extend the argument. I mean, I just say this when it comes to statues. They are and should be products of their time. And unfortunately, the statues, for example, Coulson, I believe Coulson, the slave owner, and again, let's just talk about this. Slave owner is a very nice term. We're talking about stealing people, raping people, murdering people, moving them from one place to another against their will, tearing families apart. You'd have thought his statue would have been built closer to his time. Well, it wasn't. It was built closer to ours in 1895. Essentially an idea to reinstate the belief at the time of Anglo-Saxon superiority over others. So, no, I'm sorry, that statue does not have any place in society. Put it in a graveyard. And as for Churchill's, well, again, I would suggest something similar. By the way, if this has the added benefit of having Margaret Thatcher's statue taken down, I know a few people who'll assist.
And this is the thing, it's divisive because obviously people of more of a right-wing mindset, more patriotic, for example, would probably only be focusing on World War II and Churchill. Those other issues are not something that would be at the forefront of their mind, and it would be similar for Margaret Thatcher. The controversies wouldn't apply to them, and obviously then is where you've got this conflict on the street where you actually had, the clash of demonstrators. You had people trying to defend the statues versus the, say, the Black Lives Matter crowd and so on. So I presume that that's the sort of thing that you would get when trying to tear statues down.
Well, I think that when it comes to patriotism and all of this, at the end of the day, they are just little bits of metal.
Yes, I mean ISIS tore statues down and an ancient ancient Syrian artifacts in Palmyra. I mean, this is whichever side does it, that's the sort of controversy you're talking about. Even if what's depicted is controversial.
ISIS were doing so on a very religious bent and showing a complete disregard, not for statues that were venerating a particular person. Mostly statues that were venerating another god. Whatever you might say about Churchill, he's not the head of a religion. My argument is very clear with statues and other such things. I wouldn't propose getting rid of them. Have them as museums.
Just out the street, yeah. For instance.
We should really consider who it is that we celebrate. I haven't seen, I'm sure that there is one or two maybe, but I haven't seen any statues in towns, I don't know, like Liverpool, for example, where the there is a large Irish population, to Momolan. I haven't seen too many statues for people who have selflessly helped groups of people. I haven't seen too many statues like that. Instead, it seems our statues tend to just be for people who promote an Anglo-Saxon Saxon vision of the world, that very insular way, and are often controversial characters
because of the predominant establishment force, I guess. I mean, I guess there could be some representation in places like Liverpool for other forces because of the history of that city. It might be possible. One thing we could get onto actually is the attempt at censorship on what perhaps has been for years liberal media that seems to have been done in the name of the Black Lives Matter movement, which they may or may not approve of, depending on who you ask. Because with some, for example, the removal of Little Britain and Come Fly With Me from streaming services, from BBC iPlayer, where it had been as one of the box sets to entertain people during the lockdown as recent as May 2020. And off paid services like Netflix and BritBox. And also, as you said, you're a fan of the League of Gentlemen, how that's been taken out of context. So the use of blackface, for example, I mean, it sound controversial, but I put the point of view that in comedy, that in drama, when you want to take on a persona, in audio and in TV production, you may put on accents. You may impersonate people from Wales, Scotland, or any country, or any race. You may do that within audio and within video. So despite the history of blackface, can it not be defended as a form of freedom of expression if there's no malicious intent within, and it doesn't actually carry a racist attitude in and of itself? I mean, so how do you feel about this censorship of very, very well-rated TV programs that were on television very recently? That Come Fly With Me was broadcast in 2010. It's been repeated throughout the tens decade on Gold, and it's been on streaming services, etc. And it's only just become a problem right now, just as the Black Lives Matter protests were underway.
Well, I haven't noted any protesters demanding that the League of Gentlemen is removed from, nor for that matter, Little Britain. I think that those programs, and I am quite happy to be educated if this view is controversial. But so far as I saw them myself, the Little Britain and the League of Gentlemen were taking the Michael out of previous more racist times, and say more racist times. I don't think we could live in more racist times in some regards, but certainly of the 50s and 60s, 70s, where blackface, gollywogs, etc., were commonplace on TV. I didn't take them as being deliberately trying to inflame racial tensions. Instead, I took them to be a comedy program. And I think and urge very seriously some caution when it is that societies or groups of people try to shut down humour and try to give everyone a singular way of thinking that is approved and sanitised. I can name a country that did that, in fact several. So from 1933, a country that bordered France, and at that period in time, Poland and
yes.
Russia, certainly did insist that people thought the same and could laugh at only certain things. So I think when it comes to the freedom of speech element of things, my option is very clear. If anyone believes that a certain group of society shouldn't have freedom of speech, or if anyone wishes to take away, any person wishes to take away somebody's freedom of speech, then they should be denied of it themselves.
So what's interesting here is that it's companies, perhaps are trying to be sort of trendy, perhaps they're being ultra cautious, or perhaps rather than protesters maybe demanding it. I don't think I've seen any petitions, or I don't think I saw anything relating to wanting to take the TV programs away from the protesters, as far as I could be aware. It just seemed to come out of the BBC. It seemed to come out of Netflix. And obviously, BritBox is owned by them, and ITV as well. Because I personally felt that I didn't like having the television history vandalised. The cultural and this cultural sort of conformism. And I felt less enthusiastic about going to another Black Lives Matter protest because I felt it was being used in that sort of way. Could that be something that you could say as well? It's actually damaging to the cause when the establishment reacts in such a way.
Well, I think the establishment essentially just occupy a place of sheer ignorance. So when we're looking at government again, we've mentioned Windrush, excuse me. Let's not forget Grenfell as well. Let's not forget the living conditions of people, of BAME communities and others. Let's not forget that. I think that Netflix, I have to say, there is an increased, I call it the sanitization of corporate image. And what I mean by that is when you look at everything must be clean, and immediately if it becomes criticized, it's removed. So Amazon has a nice outward public smile, and yet if you just take one step into one of their factories, one of their workhouses, you'll find miserable conditions and all of that. So all of this, and perversely with Amazon, perversely, a lot of their warehouses, their workhouses, I should say, are staffed by, yes, you've guessed it, BAME members of society. So no, when it comes to this sanitized view of things, I am deeply cynical of companies that have decided to just get rid of a particular show because it contained a thing, unless that issue is in the public mind and it is uncomfortable. Are we going to now stop, for example, at the risk of sounding like some jingoist, it's certainly not my intention, but you could make an argument that Faulty Towers depiction of Manuel is a version of blackface for the Hispanic community, played by an English actor. We don't do that because we know that it is intrinsically not about race or anything like that. It's about a typically British. In fact, the one thing that's unique, I would suggest, about British humour is our ability to take the piss out of ourselves. I say this as quite an important point, because I genuinely believe, other than the protests and the campaigns against Mosley in the 30s, one of the reasons that Mosley didn't do as well and why people couldn't take him seriously is because we started to laugh at him. His ridiculous little moustache, his pathetic emulation of Hitler, the daft hand signals, and the fact that his followers, as today, are not exactly the master race when you look at them, and their odious thoughts, these great oxygen thieves. I think that British humour shouldn't be sanitised, and I think this has begun with, the likes of Miranda and the likes of, sorry to those people who like crap like that, but it basically, and Lee Evans and these people who come on stage, strangle the keys, and then off they go. We now won't have the likes of Frankie Boyle. We won't have the likes of Frankie Boyle, who's left wing and has been an anti-apartheid campaigner. He is always on the front line when it comes to anti-racism, etc., etc. We can't have things that are too risky because it affects the status quo.
Well,
So we,
he's been on and off the BBC, and yes, he's faced periods of being banned because he made that joke about Katie Price's disabled son, for example. But as you say, he's very much on the left side in his person.
this entire business of purging TV of anything that might cause offence. I mean, when it comes to freedom of speech, as I say, if someone wants to take away your freedom of speech, I firmly believe that person should not be permitted to have freedom of speech themselves. So if someone says because of someone's religion or race, they shouldn't, there's some sort of repressive attitude that seeks to curtail their freedom of expression, that person shouldn't have it. So to all those fascists out there who think that it's good news, that tell you what we can do, we'll go out with a counter-protest and we'll show them, we'll stop them from talking. Well, sorry, if you want to stop someone from expressing a view, you're not allowed it yourself.
But actually, it's what it's caused is the removal of these shows. Actually, it's emboldened the right wing, and I've had a look at a few places, and it's confirming all their prejudices about the left. Actually, that they're just authoritarian. They want to control humour. They want to stop satire and any freedom of thought. And so, I would say it's deeply damaging these decisions.
I don't think, when we talk about the left, when we're talking about, I think it was Peter Hitchens who said recently, that left wing has taken over Britain. I'm sorry, no, it's not the left wing, it's liberals and conservatives the liberals who don't wish to offend anyone.
But of course they're not liberal then, are they? They're not liberal because that's not what liberal means. Obviously, because you would have the freedom to make that show and to continue to watch and enjoy it, wouldn't you?
I was more referring to the economic liberal, but I completely agree. What we've got to be very careful with, unless we are wanting to hurtle towards the 1930s. I mean, we've got the hallmarks, haven't we? We've got the pandemic. We've got the Spanish flu of today. We've got the now unavoidable economic depression ahead of us, and if we want to know what that looks like, if you're wondering why it is that fascists are on the rise, it's because people aren't doing anything to stop them. I think freedom of expression is something that comes with, regrettably, a very poisonous but a necessary part to it, which is people don't have the right not to be offended. Again, this is all part of the, if you want to descend into a society that has groupthink, of a society that is told the way to think, that's the way for it. You don't have a right not to be offended. And unfortunately, we seem in some elements of society to be slipping towards, I'm offended, therefore that person should lose their job, that person should be banned, we should remove this show. No, you don't have a right not to be offended. Being offended is one of the key parts of freedom of speech. You do have a right not to be discriminated against. You do have a right not to be subject to vile abuse. You do have a right not to be victimized and harassed. But in terms of offence, no, because a society that goes down that route of will remove things up until the point where no one is allowed to be offensive, I'm afraid that isn't freedom of speech, that's censorship. There are views out there that some people might say that they like Lambda or Lee Evans. I find that distasteful, doesn't offend me, but fine.
Well, you just find it naff, and that's the difference. You wouldn't want it banned, would you? Whereas, this idea of, the insults of snowflake triggering and all this is because that seems to wield power now. People can say, and I'm not sure how representative of the overall population, For example, if there were some people on Twitter making social media posts to look at Little Britain and Comply With Me's content, when people complain about a show because they are offended or triggered, and then it actually does get removed, how representative is that of the views of everybody? Because that's undemocratic as well, isn't it? Because that's just a few people. How do we quantify even the level of offence? I mean, to exactly how many people are offended just from a couple of comments on social media, say?
This is again part of that sanitisation. This is I don't know, how many people have watched League of Gentlemen or Little Britain. I'd certainly be interested to see when they were originally broadcast, how many complaints were received by the BBC at the time, and to then see whether or not Netflix was correct in its removal. But again, I just say this sanitisation, this assuming, to try and be on the side of people, coming from the likes of Netflix and Amazon, who, as I say, behind the scenes are quite happy to, especially in Amazon's case, quite happy to.
Now it says there's another hour because I've removed the raw pictures. I'm developing. I'll have to take this off on the developing like a made-up world as well. Where I'm drawing the maps partly, but I'm just we're doing the scans of that. It's better than a pandemic.
So where will we?
Yes. So you were
where
talking
did we
about.
Get up to?
We're talking about Amazon and the warehouse because at least Netflix doesn't have people doing timed lapse around a warehouse, even if it was the first to ban the content.
No, yes.
So there isn't there isn't all these Netflix champions. So that was about that, and which about taking offence, and the idea that also that it's probably undemocratic as well. We don't even know how many people it represents, even if you did allow it in the first place to take away, because that would be the majority taking away the minority as well and what they want. So again, you would not have the freedom, would you? But that's the situation we're going into now. So, okay, so we just lost the signal before. Got back with Jay Martin. Now you're in South France, not near Spain, according to locals, because that's over some mountains. So really, you were just saying really that there shouldn't be these levels of protection for people just feeling the emotion of feeling offended, which I guess is a negative emotion, because the words triggered, for example. Now, if you look at safe spaces and triggering, for example, this has become a phenomenon over the tens. The idea that somebody won't come into a safe space and talk about things, maybe views of which people would find offensive, for example, and that might not exist in, say, a motorway station or a service cafe. But the safe spaces and then trigger warnings. Presumably, all these are aimed at micromanaging the situation to make sure that there's nothing that can cause offence, but also saying that it will cause emotional damage. So, what do you think of all that then? Do you think that's because that's how far it has gone, isn't it?
Like I say, I'm a firm believer in defending freedom of expression, freedom of speech. I am not remotely in favour of any sort of discrimination, any ick or ist behaviour, that is to say racist, homophobic behaviour. I see on a regular basis religious officials seemingly attacking me, albeit not personally, because of my sexual orientation. They're entitled to their view, as nonsensical as it is. According to me, they're entitled to their view. Am I offended by it? I could be. But if I was, that is the price for freedom of expression. You don't always agree. It's the way that we learn. So when we're looking at these sort of safe spaces, etc., and really look, I mean, don't get me wrong. If there is a fascist in a workplace and they have expressed fascist terms, I'm quite happy to say that I firmly believe that they should be sacked for holding those views. I say that with the weight of the millions of dead that littered Europe and the millions of dead from various religions, race, creed, sexual orientations, again, for example. So, no, like I say, fascists or any authoritarian for that matter, who by their very nature want to stop people being able to express themselves, they really shouldn't have it. But equally, that means that liberals who increasingly seem to not like the fact that they're disagreed with, that in itself is also a route to a sort of totalitarianism, or it's the slow creep towards it. Because as soon as you say to someone, I disagree, and to know what I'm going to do is, instead of considering your opinion, empathizing, looking at it, and then disagreeing, or maybe agreeing, or formulating your own opinion, instead we're very quickly going to groupthink. By the way, this doesn't apply, this isn't, and I think your listeners know that this isn't about Black Lives Matter. This is more towards the, I'm offended by this because it doesn't agree, because you don't agree with me, therefore you shouldn't have your opinion. These people, I think, are incredibly dangerous for freedom of speech.
Yes, and as I said, it's becoming from. I mean, you might have associated that sort of thing with fascism in the past. That there should be a certain way to think, and when you're outside it, you're the enemy. And it's, as I said, it's coming from using the term liberal from people on the left. I mean, I've at least dubbed it the authoritarian left rather than the liberal left, because it's a state in which they are saying to others that you must think in a certain sort of way. It's not just a difference of opinion. I mean, people have expressed the opinion that a difference of opinion is a difference in morality, so as a way of justification that it's not going to be explored, or there's not going to be a debate. It is just wrong, according to them.
Well,
and
these are the people who, right now are only interested in the topic of racism because it's trending. And for someone who has been a lifelong campaigner of equality, personally, just as an aside on this, I genuinely believe that we should be campaigning to get rid of labels. There aren't races of human beings, there are human beings. If you go back to antiquity, you look at the Romans and the Greeks, they didn't have words for homosexual, bisexual, heterosexual, people just were. And I think we need to go back to that. We don't need more labels to divide us, we need less to unite us.
Although they did have a situation of prejudice, otherwise nobody would have been thrown to the lions. So it couldn't have been a wonderfully egalitarian, tolerant society, could it? It must have.
No, it wasn't,
quite deep
and
flaws.
neither's ours.
Exactly. So all societies have their flaws, and we're taking a certain path now. Well, an example of I'll just bring up directly the where someone defriended me on Facebook over the over Come Fly With Me. They said it is racist and transphobic. And they wouldn't allow any debate on it, and that was it. So, for example, so by saying that, it's a sort of groupthink. You've got to think that, or else I'm not your friend anymore. If you don't agree with that, So, is that the direction that we're heading? Really, is that people can put. You've got a certain groupthink about something. Anybody who wants to challenge that intellectually is the enemy. Is part of the problem. Because there are always more shades of grey the way to look at things, aren't there? And that's something we need more of that balance in society, to say, well, to maybe even just over debaters to say, well, why do you find that depiction racist? Why do you find that to be discriminatory against people of trans? So,
well, we don't learn from just agreeing with each other, and like I say, it's not a flawed position to take. I genuinely believe if someone starts displaying Nazi, fascist iconography, symbology, I don't want anything to do with that person, and that's just an end of story. I don't wish to learn from these people because there is nothing to learn. But just because we disagree with someone, it's not going to help influence change people's minds by isolating them, deleting them. We've taken the muck approach to discussion, debate, and we've confused debate with disagreement and therefore extremism. You know, the number of people who are you're a Stalinist, you are, you're a you're like Hitler, in forums and all of this. And actually, it's not that. It's the fact that if you're disagreeing with someone, the whole point of it is to try and influence their opinion. Isn't that the art of debate? Isn't that probably explains why we don't have too many philosophers anymore, because we're not allowed to. I wonder how Christopher Hitchens would find himself despised today, I think. But it is, for a lot of people who don't understand, I mean, I just want to bring it back to Black Lives Matter. Calling everyone black, calling everyone Asian or ethnic minority or minority ethnic is actually unhelpful, I think, when dealing with the matter of racism. We've got to try to understand how racism towards different minority groups is expressed and the distinctive features of anti-black racism, which is central to what's going on today. And we've also got to understand that anti-black racism isn't just perpetrated by white people. And with that questioning, and as someone who is white saying this, I can almost hear people on Twitter and that saying, I'm not allowed to have an opinion because
of that. Well, that's an interesting point I've got to, because one of the things that was said to me in these debates, if you could call them that, was that because I am white, which is, I'm not particularly interested in the fact that I'm white, actually, because I just feel like I'm an individual as well. Which is what this whole thing is about as well, isn't it? To recognise each other as individuals rather than labels about what our colour of skin is exactly, and, as if that really does matter so much. But it mattered to them because they said, because I was white, I wasn't allowed to have any opinion on this, because I can't understand or empathise with the plight of black people. But surely we can. Surely anybody can.
Discrimination, racism, however it is expressed. I don't like I say, I don't like labels. We have much more in common with each other than that divides us. And of course, everyone can have an opinion. Of course, everyone can. I don't find it personally offensive if a heterosexual wants to discuss and defend bisexual or homosexual lifestyle, culture, orientation, however you want to express it. I don't find that offensive personally. In fact, I welcome that people are understanding issues that face my own community in this way. So, like I say, shutting down debate because you disagree or you agree, and turning social media into echo chambers is going to be the undermining and the undoing of the rights that have been so hard fought, I should say, over the decades and centuries.
And so that's where we're heading. Because that's where all the criticism comes. Actually, is that once the people are in echo chambers, nothing's really being challenged, and also, so we can grow intellectually, spiritually, and so on. We need to consider other views and look at other people's paths. And actually, that was once a very left-wing thing to do, to put yourself in other people's minds, see how it is for them, and actually explore alternative ideas sometimes. Perhaps even a bit of ideas that belong to either side. It's a broad spectrum, but there can be validity in lots of things, sometimes in unlikely places. And when we're in an echo chamber, we can't grow. It just becomes more like groupthink, and then anyone who expresses anything different to that is the enemy. And this is like, as you said, George Orwell's Animal Farm. That's what happened there. So one thing you were going to talk about was the historical difference between Spanish flu outbreak and this COVID. One thing is because of all of the worldwide communications that are instant, because of the internet, they have. I think that is what is partly, well, say the word partly, but maybe completely enabled the almost global lockdown. Because at one point, individual towns and villages were not able to communicate instantly with each other, and that meant that you could probably walk freely through England during the plague, for example, or go on a horse. There might have been a local lockdown in a place like Eyam in Derbyshire, for example. But without global communication, you can't shut down travel, slow travel. But now it's all we're living in an interconnected world where they do know people's movements. If you're in a car, they got your number plate, for example. Yeah, and we're carrying around these forms of ID, social media. Whether if we enable GPS on phones, they are able to see. Although you might think it's private, they're able to amass the movement of almost all citizens during the lockdown period. But they know where everybody is when they're carrying a phone around. So what's your thoughts really on how things were with the Spanish flu and the attempts to suppress it, and what's happened with this?
Well, I think firstly, I mean the introduction's interesting. It was of course much more difficult for people to speak to their comrades around the world. But they did. They found it, it was much more difficult. But with the advent of the telephone and telegraph, people were communicating around the world. Just reminded of some industrial action. The Match Girl strike, the London Dockers strike in 1888 and 1889.
The telegraph was still
respectively.
There, yes. So they were able to use that, yes.
Yeah, they were using that to, both strikes received significant amount of international support from the United States to New Zealand. So, yes, it's easy for us to speak and to travel today, but I'd be hard-pressed if I found many people in the UK knowing what workers face in New Zealand or, in fact, in the United States. But it's interesting you mentioned the plague. I'd also find it very difficult for the average person to be jumping on a horse. They'd be more likely during the plague to be on a bull or maybe a cow. We hadn't selectively bred them to have such large udders. They could move at some pace.
And was that also wealthy people, was it? Was it that travelled around coaching horses that, as you know, that they often... they began to become victims of the highwaymen and knew that there was plunder to steal on the roads, for example.
Certainly the wealthy, yes. Look, there are a lot of comparisons with pandemics that have gone before us, but I think we've got to be careful. From the outset, we do not know whether or not COVID-19 is a seasonal flu. It is possible that this particular virus has been around a little longer or much longer than we realise. But in terms of the virus itself, it is disproportionate. Let's just look at this. We've just been talking about Black Lives Matter. It is disproportionately disaffecting people in poor economic backgrounds from BAME community, whether that's because of the general economic racism that goes on, or the social racism in terms of housing. Whether that's part of it, we don't know. There was some suggestion from the Jewish Chronicle that the virus was affecting Jewish men, particularly from Orthodox communities, slightly worse than it is general parts of the population. There's a lot of this virus that we don't know too much about, but it's not bacteria. So another one of the mythbusters I just thought I'd just raise is in fact to do with this notion that If you keep your feet warm, you will somehow avoid the virus.
Well, there's lots of things like that, aren't
Well,
there? Every time, when you've got the plague, for example, that there were people coming up with ideas as to what would solve it, or how you would not get it. So it's kind of nothing new to hear that you get that with this. I mean, another topic as well. We might have to wait to get onto this just a little bit. Is that the rise in conspiracy theory belief seems to be very intrinsic with this one as well. The idea that it might not be what it's.
I think with conspiracy, you're certainly looking at lack of trust in government, shutting down freedom of expression, general suspicion of services, and the fact that there are proven conspiracies out there, from Epstein to to even Vietnam. There is a lot of suspicion, but again, just on these shoes. Wearing warm feet in slippers, wearing warm feet, that would be interesting. Yeah. Keeping your feet warm. This is not a bacteria, this is a virus. It may make you feel comfortable, but it isn't a cure. Equally, taking antibiotics is, they don't work against viruses. So, again, just for a few facts. Where there's some link with the Spanish flu, there's a lot of concern about a so-called second wave. So people are looking at the Spanish flu. They quote 1919. Actually, when we look at the Spanish flu, you can look at the period 1918 to 1920. The symptoms were, and it's called Spanish flu because it was believed that Spain had a much worse death toll than other countries. In fact, it most likely originated in Texas, although I have noted that there are some American websites that are trying to say it started in China. Wherever it started, the first case seems to have been in the southern United States. The symptoms of the Spanish flu, very typical to seasonal flu. It was more severe for some people, that is to say, people of people who were more vulnerable because of underlying illnesses, older people, and it led to death for a lot. By the end of the Spanish influenza, it is estimated that 1/3 of the world's population was infected.
So really, it's nothing. This would therefore seem, even though it's quite high numbers when you look at it, in some ways, it would seem a lot smaller than that then, because...
It's certainly possible. However, if you consider that we're in effect in the West around about 6 months, well, we're certainly less than a year into this particular pandemic, we don't have there isn't enough data to understand what type of virus this is. For example, the worst strains of Spanish flu. I'm just looking at some graphs. You're looking at June of 1918 and before, where there are we're looking at death rates for flu. There is some potential that the flu was around even before that. I mean, one of the theories about Spanish flu is that the stress of war, stress undermines the immune system. Your body secretes a hormone known as cortisol, which inhibits it inhibits your immune system, amongst other things. I'd love to talk about cortisol. It's one of my favourite topics to talk about, especially when we're looking at epidemiology. But there is this school of thought that actually war was the reason that there was so much death.
Given the timing, yes. Given the timing, it was right at that point, so it was a negative period of human history, particularly, and it would, and that hypothesis would fit pretty well, wouldn't it? With
Yes, certainly, and it killed more people than the First World War in total. We were talking, maybe 50 to 100 million. I mean, one of the other things that this Spanish flu did is it affected pigs. And almost certainly, I mean, Spain was it was affected, 250,000 deaths plus, but Italy, 390,000, France 240,000, England and Wales 200,000. I mean, if we're looking at sort of death tolls and all of this, they are relatively large. So there's a lot of similarities to the way that the coronavirus and the way that quarantine occurred with the so-called Spanish flu and what was going on and what is going on today. So, for example, one of the initial ideas, this is from London, replicated in New York and major cities, was instead of the ability to go out shopping, instead to begin window shopping as a form of distance, which might sound just a little bit odd to us, but when we're talking about when we're talking about distancing in this way, that was one of the ways in which they undertook it. Ultimately, they ended up shutting shops, limiting people. Certainly, Red Cross, certainly volunteer brigades for distributing food at cost were undertaken. It ultimately led to the establishment of what we would probably recognise today as the so-called Nightingale hospitals, vast centres to deal with flu patients. I mean, in a very basic way, emergency hospitals with camp beds where people were treated, left to recuperate. And because of the seasonal nature of that particular virus, there have been some further comparisons brought today. For example, I mean, we don't know if seasonal factors are going to affect COVID-19. What we do know is it is in every population of every country on the planet. There isn't a country that hasn't been spared. There are some countries that speculate that they have 0 cases. Again, we don't know the symptoms and how it's affecting. There is a school of thought now that suggests that once the virus spreads or we become infected through a pulmonary system as we breathe, that it's somehow becoming an infection of the blood. Flu, more generally, has a lower transmission in summertime because of a combination of a few effects. So higher humidity, increased UV light, that is to say from the sun, and people spend less time or tend to spend less time inside in closer quarters. One of the reasons I think needs to be considered for the higher toll initially in Spain and Italy was because a lot of their families, large families, lived together in some areas. There were cultural reasons why the virus was spreading rapidly even after they locked down. We have seen a slowing and decline in Italy and Spain, and we can certainly explain that by people not going out, so locking down. But this is what was going on back with the Spanish flu as well. The reason people are getting very excited, and I use that term deliberately at the moment, is because they are talking about this so-called second wave. The second wave of the Spanish flu was much worse than the first, and people are speculating that this is essentially what's going to happen. I do have to say, just so I can put my cards on the table, As someone who has studied epidemiology um, and speaks to people who are on the front line and studying this particular virus, I have to say it is my view that there is going to be a second wave when we hit flu season, and I do believe that this is going to be worse than what we've gone through already. I hope not. I'm not saying that to worry people unnecessarily, but I am just saying this because transportation is much easier today than it was in 1919, as we've already addressed. And with it being already in the population, it seems to be that as the weather has improved, the rates have declined. How effective lockdowns have actually been, I don't know. And the one thing about coronaviruses, which the mass distrust in government seems to have really been sort of ignored for this bit, is the government has said that there'll be a cure by September. Now, whilst it's not 1919 Spanish flu, I do remember, well, I don't remember personally, but I do recall reading that in 1914, troops were told, don't worry, it'll all be done by Christmas,
That's what they
referring
hoped.
to the war. Coronaviruses have been around, like I say, beta coronavirus, as I mentioned last time, beta coronavirus from 3300 BC, one of the earlier examples of a coronavirus that has been found. These things have been with us. Common cold, flu, all examples. There are many others. Human coronavirus, rhinoviruses, etc., all part of the same family. We haven't cured them. There
No,
is no cure for the common cold.
and
And if we're serious,
it uses coronaviruses as part of the common cold often, and rhinoviruses. So it's just this a more virulent strain. This one.
yeah. So if we're suggesting that there's going to be a cure for a coronavirus by September, I'd suggest that anyone listening to this thinks again.
So,
Almost certainly that will not be the case.
so what do you think if they try to go back to lockdowns and things? Do you think now that the population having been through that, and then and a lot of people, in many ways, it's impractical, but also a lot of people are not really following it as well because obviously there have been people to have people round and still go places. You've had the Dominic Cummings thing, which now means people think, well, if people who work for the government directly aren't that interested in following it directly, why should we follow it? And then you have a second wave. Could they really do the same level of enforcement again? Would they even try? Would they handle it differently this time? Would they do something else, do you think?
Well, there's almost certainly going to be a second wave, and please don't think there's going to be a second wave if next week the rates of infection begin increasing. This isn't a second wave. We're still in the first one. Really, I'm referring to a noticeable dip followed by a period of stability. That is to say, if it goes down to zero, new cases per day to 50, 100, something that is relatively stable, and then you see an increase. Now, if Dominic Cummings should be removed from his position, and frankly should be sentenced or tried for various breaches of legislation, too numerous to talk about just now. But his idea of his trip to Durham and his media carnival during his interview with the press was very carefully staged, in my opinion, essentially to say to people who still have trust in the government, go out, it's fine, he can do it, so can you.
Do you think it was actually a deliberate thing to actually try and loosen the lockdown from government? Because obviously
Yes.
they're trying to get the economy moving. Obviously, when you're having to live with these highness restrictions, it might have, from a conspiracy point of view, when some people who thought that it wasn't what it seemed, should we say, would just think, well, there's no point in following the lockdown anyway. So So it would have.
Uh,
So
it was it was very careful, and for anyone who has studied psychology, if I mention the term duper's delight, I'd invite you to watch the interview again. Pay close attention to the end of the interview. Duper's delight is a subconscious, or sometimes conscious, in fact, smile that is given without any interaction from others, and it's a smile that's very particular, that suggests that someone's got away with it, and most certainly he had.
So
and that's called Duper's delight.
You see that in soaps, or people trying to act that, obviously.
Yeah.
But you're saying, but it sounds more like it's not a situation of getting away with it. It was all part of a deliberate ploy anyway. So actually, that was the plan, to do that, to make to actually loosen the lockdown, to make people think about just interacting in society again. Obviously, if you're living on your own and things like that, it's hard to live by those restrictions anyway. So this is where I might meet some controversy, because I would think that I would rather live in England, where you're free to do a few more things that would keep you sane, rather than in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, where things are still strict and you're on a form of curfew. And that, and it's 3 months since the actual lockdown began on March the 23rd, and it doesn't show much signs of going to even the stage of liberation that England has got to in those places. Just a few relaxations, but nothing like here yet. So,
well, I think if we're really clear about it, I mean, for example, in March of 1918, Spanish flu was spreading across the US, albeit just a handful of cases. So if you look at St. Louis, which St. Louis is Missouri, if my memory's right.
Yeah, it is.
They basically, the city of St. Louis shut down public gatherings and forcibly quarantined any victims to the flu within their own homes. And the number of cases began to slow. Whilst 1,500 million people around the world were dead, including 500,000 Americans, the death rate in St. Louis was half the rate in Philadelphia, where they did next to nothing.
Oh, they allowed a parade. So it's interesting. They allowed a parade that would normally take place, and then they saw a spike in cases. So, yeah, that's very clear example. So it sounds like then, maybe the communication thing's an issue. They didn't have a US-wide ban. Even now, it's federal government-based. I mean, we've seen these anti-lockdown protests targeting governors, because they're the ones, like Nicola Sturgeon in the SNP in Scotland and Mark Drakeford in Wales, they're the ones responsible for setting the lockdown policies in, say, Michigan and so on, rather than a federal. There is no actual US-wide lockdown response.
No, and the reason why I draw that comparison between the different responses is, it is my view that the clearly 70,000, as we speak, 75,000 deaths plus in the UK are squarely at the hands of this incompetent government. And the reason I say that with some anger in my voice is, we knew that this was coming. This wasn't a case of, let's shrug our shoulders. We could have begun to close down the airports. We could have begun to isolate people in their homes. We could have started to track and trace and undertake some of the measures that were beginning in Japan, South Korea and China. We could have done that.
So
it was a choice not to.
So when you look at the lack of response, that's how many people are out in my street today. You wouldn't really know there was a lockdown for many weeks now. Obviously, the idea is to stay, not go out too much, sort of thing, is still prevailing. And you're saying it's actually a choice rather than just them being overwhelmed by, not really knowing what to do. A bumbling response, a bit like, the idea is, we might try and see if we can have some herd immunity. Is that going to work? What's going to happen to the economy? Do you think it was actually a deliberate thing to keep...
I genuinely think, I know what these people studied. They studied, for example, if you look at Cummings, and anyone can have a look at some of the things he was writing about when he was studying at Durham University. I would look at the economics that this brand of concentrated Thatcherism and worse have brought in, this popularism, this hard right-wing response. They believe in Darwinism. They believe that businesses, should be supported by the government in a non-corrupt way, I say sarcastically, as they begin privatising their mates' debt. Nationalising their mates' debt and privatising the country's profit. These people believe in survival of the fittest. This, the approach they are taking is a form of social Darwinism. And they have the clear response throughout all of this I don't think it has been bumbling. I don't think it has been idiotic, as some in the press have suggested. I think it has been a deliberate herd immunity, survival of the fittest approach. There were voices, eugenicists during the Spanish flu who was saying, well, we'll end up with a stronger species at the end of this. The likes of Cummings, Johnson, Trump, all of this, Bolsonaro in Brazil, you name it, they all occupy this social Darwinistic eugenics approach. At the end of the day, here's what we know from other epidemics. We don't know too much about this virus, but hey, we have gone through pandemics before. We know that distancing works. It doesn't help immunity. We don't want to live in a plastic bubble. But I have to say this, as people say, as people complain, oh, we were in lockdown for a month, 2 months, 3 months. Well, yes, I'd just remind you, again, looking at the Spanish flu and the time just before it, soldiers were trapped in trenches for years. Working class were trapped in tenements in squalid conditions for years. The idea that we today, with our computers, TV, our food deliveries, and all of this, are unhappy having spent weeks in lockdown, essentially for our own protection, is staggering. And wow. This is where I think the project with Johnson has always been, with this virus, we'll show face to our trading friends, but at the earliest opportunity, we're back to herd immunity.
I do wonder, though, because those comparisons are drawn, obviously, that we have all this technology and that we can enjoy ourselves inside, we can play games, consoles, or even do gardening. Obviously, there have been situations, though, obviously, where people have taken their own lives, despite having modern comforts. It doesn't replace, the need for social interaction, for meaning and purpose in life. They're just, I don't know, it's empty and hollow, it's materialistic in some ways. So, it has helped to get us through, but also it hasn't been enough for some people to live in.
But I also think, again, when we're looking at suicide, my brother having lost and family, I should say, having just recently lost a incredibly close family friend, myself having lost people quite recently, friends and people I've worked with to suicide. Whilst we're talking about lockdown, let's also not forget the 10 years of underfunding for mental health services. As we said at the top of the programme, about plus 100,000 plus disabled people who've taken their own lives because of government actions. Let's be clear that government actions, if they have done what they did in New Zealand, Korea, yes, they've got smaller populations, but they could have taken a sensible approach to this track, trace, shut down the airports, 14-day quarantine, harsh measures, but we wouldn't have been in lockdown for as long. So for those people who have lost people to suicide, it's not just my condolences, but I do understand exactly how you're feeling, and I would give you a hug and sod the virus if I was near you. It's a terrible thing, an absolutely appalling state, and yes, I'd dwell on suicide for too much longer.
But what's interesting is that the more left-wing governments have obviously, because of public protection, they've carried it on longer. But people who are living on their own or are suffering under the lockdown might well find it easier in the more liberal England, and therefore actually it's kind of a role reversal where we might realise that the government is corrupt, but actually it's enabling more freedom that enables you to live your life, despite, as long as you maintain social distancing while it's virus is out there. So one of the things they did say was that for people living on their own, you can now go to a household bubble legally, but that you're not allowing that in Wales, for example. So there must be people very lonely there who are suffering.
But this is the problem. The government's approach is both short-termist. It hasn't considered if this wave that we've gone through, this first wave, the initial infection wave, is minor compared to a exponential second wave. The reason for that is because we've not done everything we can to eradicate wave one. And I think if the rates of infection per day don't drop below 150, it's almost certain, in my view. As I say, I'm saying it's almost certain. I will concede we don't know enough about this virus to know if it's seasonal. So I might find myself eating these words, but I would suggest if it is a traditionally seasonal virus, then the government's actions by not having taken much more drastic measures initially, and only listening to scientific advice that seems to fit with political theory, mark these words: if this second wave is worse, the death rate will be appalling. And if that is the case, I will hold personally, and I think the country should, one Dominic Cummings and one Boris Johnson. In fact, why just name them individually? The entirety of the British government to account, and I would suggest people do the same.
Well, that comes back to the question, actually, is that if it did go to the second wave and it was kind of the same conditions as the first, where it was rising again and so on, I don't know how much immunity would have been built up. I mean, actually, that's one thing about a lockdown, is that you can't help the people who can get through it get the immunity because you're trying to get them away from the virus at all. But again, can they enforce? That's what I want to know. Could they enforce the same situation as back in March a second time, or is that over? It's just not going to be possible a second time. People aren't going to give up their liberties again because I just want to know how likely is that?
Well, first thing, just to say that it passing through the population clearly hasn't worked, because whilst we're in lockdown at the moment, it's estimated that around about 6% of Londoners have antibodies. That is to say, they are immune to the current strain of COVID-19. Remember the strain that's going through? There are now over 14 strains. But the ones that are affecting most of us are one strain which seems to give more milder symptoms, another more serious, but it's not necessarily adapted for human beings. And whilst the virus is relatively stable, it can and is adapting for easy transmission. Viruses aren't alive. But there is a sort of evolution with them to make transmission more easy. Now, if herd immunity was successful, Sweden, who's reaping the consequences now of inaction, again, you're looking at immunity of around about 6%. So that is to say 94% of the population to go. if you were dealing with, let's say, a 4 to 5 times worse outbreak in a secondary wave than the first, the government wouldn't have any choice than to lock down. Otherwise, you could potentially be looking at 6 months of utter misery. I mean, who will stock the supermarkets if if the people who stock the shelves are dead or infected and crippled with flu-like conditions?
So really, you just think we'd probably go back to the same lockdown as we've already had, really, and that would be enforceable.
Well, I would really hope we don't, because the current lockdown has been confused. It has been ill thought out, and like I say, in my view, it has been geared towards herd immunity. But what for example, you can meet a child in a park, but you can't go with both parents. It's totally nonsensical.
Well, yes, but that's changed now with the gatherings of 6. I mean, it's even changed in Wales, except for the edict of staying within 5 miles. I'm sure everybody does that. I'm sure if it's 10 miles, I'm sure they still go. But basically, it's the biggest infringement of our civil liberties that we've ever had in history, and it includes. Well, I could ask, if you look back at the so-called Spanish or Texan flu in 1918. Were they able to have a UK-wide lockdown in response? Was it different?
Well, they did have a lockdown.
So, how did it? Well, with the historical knowledge, which is really good, how did it work compared to today's?
Well, generally, you've got to bear in mind that you've got working class people who. Like today, essential workers, they, were told to go into work, but where cities ended up providing things like soup kitchens, there was a lot of philanthropy in the US, if you wish to look at the Texan idea. So again, soup kitchens, hospitals. You see, in times of pandemics, it doesn't really matter. The virus isn't discriminatory. It affects people in a discriminatory way because the way humans organise society, the virus doesn't care whether you're black, white, or whatever else. It goes for the easiest of access, and that applies to whether you're rich or poor in this way. So there tends to be a little bit more philanthropy than all of that.
Yes, because we've almost turned socialist in some ways. We have. It's turned this government, although it might appear very corrupt, into having to do, very socialist schemes to enable, the pandemic response, within the community, to enable people to be at home, One thing is, and I don't know if it's a controversial point, but they did think, and I'm not sure what the source of this is that people with darker skins were just simply more susceptible, not just simply for the economic and social reasons, which, might still have a part to play in it, but just because of scientific reasons of the way that their bodies do respond to the virus, which means that they have been more susceptible. And that wasn't an issue of discrimination so much as a scientific reason.
Well, I'm always very cautious about scientists. Let's not forget scientists can also have political opinions. I'm always very cautious of a scientist that says that because of someone's skin pigmentation, they're more likely to catch something.
And we would have to see, obviously, we'd have to look into what it is that, that makes them more susceptible, so they believe. But, or whether that is just, because...
I think the ghettoization in the United States, I think the economic conditions that certain sections of our society have been forced to live in, for the reasons we discussed before, I think that has quite a lot to say about it. Like I said, it's not just war. You've got economic stress, you've got social stress, you've got work stress,
which means your body is less healthy, and the cortisol means it's weaker, yes. Which is a great explanation, really, for why we had this sudden pandemic happen just after World War One, because it was a horrible time and people were feeling horrible, and then they started. The bodies became weaker. So, well, I was even wondering if there could be comparisons to some of the unrest of 2016. You know, where we had the uncertainty over Europe, and you know, whether that has led to a pandemic. You know, possibly because people are more susceptible.
I actually think, and this is one of the reasons why I think there is going to be a second wave. So, the lifting of quarantine measures and social distancing with the Spanish flu wasn't just the reason for a second wave. There were lots of people moving, returning back home. There was a lot of movement, which almost certainly assisted, to the extent of how much that contributed to the second wave in the Spanish flu. It is still subject for a lot of heated discussion.
Things are different now, though, aren't they? I think, you know, in terms of, you know, surely things are a little bit more stable with where people are living, and
well,
you know.
I'm not so sure about that, and the reason I say this is, yes, we haven't got people returning from major war zones as we did in the First World War, but most certainly people are now, well, you know, just today, announcements of redundancies, companies using furlough to get rid of people. We've seen a 20.4% collapse in GDP growth in April alone, wiping off decades of advancement. Well, almost certainly this generation, the next generation, is going to have a worse economic outlook than the generations previous. And almost certainly the fact that people are now finding themselves in potential redundancy situations by, again, greedy employers, by and large, some desperate business owners, I have to say, but by and large, certainly in Cumbria, for example, where you have layoffs just on a company's greed. That stress of, I had someone on the phone to me today explaining that they just bought a house and just been given their redundancy notices. That is going to impact their health. Whether or not it means that they're likely or going to get COVID is something else. But that level of stress, that financial stress, most certainly will have an effect on mental and physical health, which, you know, isn't positive when you're wanting your immune system in fighting order in these times.
With cortisol, but also obviously prolonged lockdown with some people means they haven't been building their immune system up very much as well, I would have thought. So that's another negative effect of it. Alongside the situation caused by it, as you say, leading to all these redundancies and all the social effects and economic effects that we're seeing.
Well, again, it's not just it's not just lockdown. No one that I know has enjoyed lockdown. I'm sure there are people who have.
Well, yes, that's interesting. That is an interesting debate, because I think there are some who have sort of enjoyed it. I think it's very divisive depending on the circumstance, and I think there is chance for positive and negatives to be shaped very differently. But I'll let you finish your point before I bring that in.
But as we leave lockdown, where are the masks being distributed? Where are the antigen tests, pathogen tests? Sorry, where are they? We've just been told that the highly spoke about Trace app has in fact now been shelved in favour of trying to spy on people using their Apple or of other accounts.
Yes, that's right. And they all seem to reject Apple and Google's offer of developing an app. But the latest Android update, which I did put on, includes a COVID alert system within it. And whether you're going to trust that or not, or use it, but a lot of people won't know it's happened. Basically, it affects more modern phones that are able to update to the latest version of Android 10. So I was going to say about lockdown is, I think it's very simple that that some people will have enjoyed some positive effects, such as getting together with the family, which obviously, there can be tensions, there can be arguments, there can be problems with it. But I think some people will have enjoyed the extra time they've been able to spend with family, and it brings up a sort of middle class picture, almost a cosy family situation. But there will be people, of course, who, if you haven't got a partner or anybody that are relying just on the outside lines, as well as obviously. People in the more toxic relationships will find that there's increased domestic violence. It's gone right up, But I do think the situation also, and it's going to sound like something off a right-wing perspective, sadly, would be for some. I've been on long-term welfare, but some people might be enjoying not having to go into work and just enjoying the time to themselves if they're not. If they're in a situation where they don't have to work from home, where the job can't be done.
God forbid those people end up having the lifestyle of a CEO.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a good thing. I personally, I support that liberty. I don't think, I even think that, going into work, being forced to do it against your will is wrong. And I'd like to see society move beyond that. That's perspective, and if people are enjoying the time to themselves, that's a good thing. But obviously, these are the situations caused by lockdown where it's sometimes there are positives like that for some people, and there are negatives for people who can't cope with the changing circumstances or not, or are left without support, which has been very lacking during the period for people who are on their own. So I would have to say, and whether you would agree, there would be some people who could obviously enjoy lockdown based on their personal circumstances, just as there are ones who cannot.
I completely agree with that. I mean, we are going to have to face the reality that the system that we've been living under is late capitalism, as some people would refer to it, isn't serving society, and we during lockdown, especially in the construction sector, where we've had people building luxury high-rise apartments in London and other cities, have been told that they're essential workers. They're not.
Just essential to capitalism that wants to continue it.
Yeah, well, exactly, and it's my broader point of when people wake up on a Monday morning and say, "Oh, I can't be bothered going to work." Is it? I don't like Monday mornings. Is it Monday mornings you don't like, or is it capitalism?
Well, that's right, because obviously it's the situation of what you would do on a Monday. Obviously, but the thing is now, there's not even the refuge of the weekend and the Monday to Friday working week because people are on call on 0-hour contracts. They're given no notice of when they might be called into work. Weekends, are completely given up. Bank holiday have no meaning, and bank holidays, they can't plan anything. They can't plan any dates. Yes. Yeah. Go ahead.
I think the point, and certainly as we sort of come to a close, is really that point. For those people who claim to be patriots, then they should really look at what was fought during the Second World War for the rights of a weekend, the rights of a decent pension, an NHS owned, controlled by the state, adequately funded, free dentistry, rights within the workplace, the dignity of a contract, even on the docks by the 60s. All of these rights have been eroded, and you tell me who did all of them. It was the current brand of the Tories, lower than vermin, according to Nye Bevan.
Oh yes.
And it's with that. I just thought just something that I'd like to close upon is really just a part of the lockdown, which directly draws comparison to the Spanish flu, and it's a part of society that doesn't get too much of a mention, and that's those people who work in education. Teachers have been lecturers, nursery nurses, all of this have still been having to go into work because they're still teaching as best they can. um, the children of essential workers. And what I thought is, the quarantine measures that were in place during the Spanish flu really resonates today. In fact, I can't think of any factor quarantine from 1918 that resonates as much today as the awkward position it left the education system in. So in 1918, schools across the country closed for Spanish flu, as we've seen today. Colleges did the same, and like colleges today, some teachers, some lecturers within colleges made the promise that classes could continue remotely.
Wow, even in 1918.
Yes, 1918. Apart from it wasn't by Zoom, as it is today, or Skype, it's that teachers were trying to do remote classes by telephone.
Oh, yes, even in the early telephone, they used it.
Yeah. And the problem was, just as today, students weren't having it. It's not just the telephone consultations or anything like that, but instructions were given by local authorities that people and teachers had to situate themselves so they could hold telephone consultations regarding lessons. So in other words, students had to agree and all of that. They weren't having it because of the uncertainty of it all and the lack of interaction. And I just thought this quote from a teacher, and I'm not going to tell you which year this is a quote from. I'll leave that for your listeners to guess to. But I'll read it. I've been sitting at the end of a telephone ever since the schools closed, and I haven't heard from a single pupil for a month.
Well, that could be this year, couldn't it? It's just as much as it could be then. Obviously, although there were fewer phones then, obviously. Getting a landline installed even in the 70s was expensive, as Frank Spencer would know from some others to happen when he wanted to get a landline extra for his chicken shed or whatever. So, So in 1918, as I mean, the last question now is, was it the same as in March 2020? Would you have the bobbies wondering why you were out in every town, and the same sort of restrictions? Only go out for several times a week, and to get the shopping, get the grocers from the local shop, which wouldn't have been a Sainsbury's or in most places, or a Tesco back then. Was that broadly similar?
Well, it's a different world. I mean, the idea of a supermarket certainly very different. But for example, some restaurants were allowed to remain open, but they couldn't serve some obscure things. I've never really got to the bottom of this, but in some countries they weren't allowed to serve, and this applied to the UK, some elements. They couldn't serve ice cream or pie. And that's, I think, due to the shared nature, but they were allowed to operate. Hairdressers were still open, albeit barbers must, and just bear in mind the difference between a hairdresser and a barber is one has an alcohol license to use barbiturates. That's an historic thing.
Oh, right. That's still the same today, is it? Yeah, obviously.
Still the same today. Yes, it comes from barber surgeon days, where, yes, they used to get people drunk. But your barber not only cut your hair, because they already had the equipment to sever limbs and carry out operations. That was the job of a barber. Hence the reason for the alcohol license. But they had to wear face coverings and all of this.
But they're not open at all now. It's July the 4th is when it's advertising to be open in this town here, Neston, for them to reopen. So, so that they were open at least.
Yes, but they were given instructions, things like they had to sterilise and scald dishes. There were, for example, police officers, if they heard anyone cough or sneeze, they would come over to ensure that you were holding a handkerchief. Smoking was banned for the first time in some areas on public transport. Some people who were displaying symptoms were forcibly quarantined. for, depending on country, between 7 and 14 days. Um, there were most towns and cities had tram networks. As in the United States, they just call them streetcars over there. There was a general limitation of the number of passengers that were permitted on the trams. And again, similar to today, instead of it being the Chinese, we should call this China flu, as Trump said. The idea that this was a German disease that had started, but don't worry, in Germany they thought it was a virus, not disease, a US virus that the US had created. And all of that. So certainly plenty of similarities to today. Flu masks were common, distancing measures there, quarantine and all of this.
Were you prevented from travel? If you wanted to go from London to Manchester in 1918, was there a lockdown to stop that, like there was in March?
Yeah, well, there was a limited number of trains, and the reason for the limited number of trains travelling such a long journey, it was due to the fact that this virus was sweeping through the population, killing hundreds of thousands. So it was, firstly a timetable issue. But then it became an issue to do with the practicalities of things.
So really, it does sound like a bit of a different lockdown. I mean, with hairdressers being open, and it doesn't necessarily sound like there was a need for a travel ban around the country because people didn't maybe move around as much or as easily as they could in a car these days.
Just remember the context of that, though. There were a lot of troops still returning from northern France who had no other option but to travel by train.
And they had to do it together, and yes, they had to obviously do it in close proximity because that's all they could do.
And that was, it's possibly one of the reasons why the virus ended up spreading in the way that it did. There were, some restrictions on travel dependent upon locality and all of this, but in practical terms, the British Expeditionary Force returning from occupied Africa, Europe mainly, and elsewhere, were using the train network. So there isn't as many cars back in 1918, most certainly not compared to today. So the entire notion of transport is much different. Quarantines were in effect for ships. Again, the word quarantine itself comes from the 40 days in which a ship had to be moored away from port should it have reported any form of illness.
Yes, we had that on a cruise ship, didn't we? We did have, we had the incident where people were quarantined on a cruise ship early on in this, didn't we? So, but of course, it's not usually set. It's usually 7 or 14 days, not 40.
Yeah. Well, this is it. Well, the idea of the quarantine comes from that. I mean, you could have a look. If you want to have a look for things like lockdowns, there was the Great Smog, I think, in 1957, or maybe it was earlier. Whilst that wasn't that wasn't a form of a cold or anything like that. That particular virus, or that particular outbreak, was due to the particulate matter and what was spreading amongst it. You can have a look for the need for social distancing. You can have a look at the
The
The way that spread through.
Well, there was a situation in well, one example was a Pennsylvanian town where the local pollution settled because of a fog-like effect and killed thousands in the town or something like that. And also we had the Great Fog of London in 1951 where this
At
smog
51, sorry, I said
51
57,
was
yes.
it was same I think the same time as this World's Fair came. This fog, because of the particular situation of the weather, seemed to bring down all the coal smoke from fires in London, and it created an almost deadly fog across much of the city.
Yeah, and basically where I was leading to with this is the Great Smog. Sorry, I said 57. I think it was 52 actually. They were blaming the deaths on an influenza outbreak and looking at lung infections. So there was some examples of bronchopneumonia, for example, or chest infections, that kind of idea. And they were thinking that this was it's a virus, as opposed to the fact that London had in fact had very poor air quality for quite a few centuries. But in terms of distancing measures, again, there are some similarities to the smog of London.
Yes, now you couldn't see when you went outside. You couldn't even see hardly into the distance. So you kind of be aware of what was going on, wouldn't you? And then just the sheer amount of coal fires. I don't see really how distancing from fellow Londoners would have made any difference in that case.
No, probably not. But again, you've got some sorts of. I mean, then again, you could go to the cholera outbreak, and if you're after sensible decisions from government, they're sometimes lacking. Cholera outbreak, where they were advising people to use a form of bleach lime wash on walls. We think today, well, that's ridiculous. How could that possibly work? But it's because, well, I believe coronaviruses, at least from memory, so please don't shout at me if I'm wrong by the date. I think it was in the 67 or certainly late 60s before even coronaviruses were discovered. So, you've got things like this just to bear in mind. The knowledge of the knowledge of how disease spreads was really still not quite in its infancy, but early days. And I'm just coming back to 1918, for example. Some people refused to leave their houses without atomizers or water vapor sprays, because they believed that those water sprays or water vapor atomizers help prevent disease by keeping the nasal and throat passages clear, which you could argue made it easy for transmission, for example. People didn't travel on unnecessary journeys on the train, or by boat and ferry, local ferries, certainly in Cumbria, and more coastally places. They didn't go because there was a great worry about catching this thing. This virus, this Spanish flu, didn't discriminate. Neither does COVID.
No. Well, it presumably doesn't, although in the way it does discriminate, actually, is that the people with underlying health conditions and diabetes and are more likely to suffer serious effects of it. So that's
just
age.
One last note on this. Whilst COVID has been shown to be more deadly in older adults, the people who are most vulnerable to the so-called Spanish flu were actually between the ages of 20 and 40.
So that was a bit worrying, wasn't it? I mean, at least now you can say that a lot of younger people can think that they're probably not going to get that much of an effect of it. I mean, although there are always rare exceptions to it, generally speaking, younger people, even up to middle age, it's just not they're not disproportionately affected at all. Whereas when it seems to be much worse with people over 60 particularly. So that's sort of an age.
I think 20 to 40 is also the main age of those serving in the trenches.
Oh yes, which would also might explain with the cortisol theory as well that that they were more susceptible for that reason, and that's why it disproportionately affected that age group back then, with
Yes.
following World War One. Well, this has been very interesting. We've got a good an update. We've seen how Black Lives Matter. The one thing I didn't ask about Black Lives Matter is, do you think part of the enthusiasm for getting out and marching things was a bit of relief from lockdown with some people as well, because there's a chance to go out and do something when being cooped in under these really bearing restrictions, it might have inflated the movement some more as well, mightn't it? Just a chance to get out and do that.
It's quite possible for some people. I would suggest the centuries of oppression might have a little more to do with it.
I mean, obviously, some people might not have even studied very much about the entire, should we say, the political landscape leading to it, and people just join in on things as they would as well. So that, maybe that would have been a bit less.
There's also frustration when Donald Trump, calls anti-fascist organisations terrorists.
Yes,
I think there's a lot of people with a growing sense that fascism is on the rise, and the only way to defeat fascism is by fighting it.
Yes, so getting out on the streets, because has he succeeded in getting Antifa labelled as a terrorist organisation officially, or is that just something proposed?
No, I believe so.
So actually, he said this is a situation now that there's a sort of civil war going on almost, where that's concerned.
Well, that is something that could occur.
Yes. Well, thanks for all your interesting perspectives on it. We've looked at Black Lives Matter, which has become such a big thing as well. Still at the time where the lockdown hasn't really receded completely, but it's become a lot more liberal in England, but it's still there. You still can't go and meet anyone from out, or bring them inside legally for sex or any other reason. There's the one household bubble. We don't know how long, depending on a second wave and all that, it's going to be before it becomes sort of a bit more normal, and not just the new normal. As in, we actually get back to just going around anybody's friend's house with no problem at all, and travelling out, anywhere and staying the night and going on a mini holiday or whatever. All that. We still don't quite seem to know how long we are away from that. It seems at the moment. So I suppose you predict that we are going to get there, even if a second wave rolls it all back.
Yeah. My thoughts are, as I said last time, very clearly, whatever people thought was the new normal. What was the normality back in February, early March? We are not going back to that. And for some, that'll be a very worrying thing. For others, quite an exciting prospect. We are now at not a crossroads, but a T-junction, I think, in society.
Just without spending too long on it now, because that'll dismay a lot of people, because the idea of getting over a pandemic or something would be that you can get back to normal, wouldn't it? You don't, as in, so, that means going around friends' houses, all of them, going on a holiday, all the things we just listed. Are you actually talking in a way that those would actually be gone for a very long time, or just life with certain restrictions in place, or altered behaviour in place for a decade or something like that?
I think altered behaviour, certainly. I mean, there's going to be the cultural whiplash of this. People are already very angsty about being next to each other in Tesco. Essentially, sorry to anyone who's from London who prefer to socially distance anyway. I know that as soon as you say hello to someone on the tube in London, they do tend to back away from you.
It's a bit different in the north even now.
But what it is that I'm suggesting is that certain behaviours that we undertake will change. School, education is going to change. It could revert back to the classroom. I think that when I say things are not returning backwards, employers are hurrying up plans for automation, which has now become the biggest threat. I agree with the analysis up until this virus, but has now become the biggest threat to working life.
Yes, if they don't provide people with money in the form of possibly universal basic income, and not provide a way of life, if there isn't all these chances to be employed because of automation being brought forward even further by this situation now.
And I mean, really wanting to go back to chronic underfunding of the NHS, being told that we can't afford things. If that's what people are wanting to go back to, that sort of normality, count me out.
Well,
but
yes, but that's a negative normality. People are missing the positive normality, aren't they, about just going round a friend's house without having to be worried that that's against the state, or being able to travel to a different part of the country, including Wales and Scotland, to be able to take a holiday, or be able to, people obviously just go to the pub, just go into a restaurant, and the cinema. People want all that back, don't they? They're not going to stand for it not being there forever, surely.
The parts of society like that, going around to friends, going to the pub, have been around for centuries, millennia. I don't think things like that are going to change. But I think for those things, I think they're a little bit more based in society. Really, what it is that I'm suggesting, though, is more in terms of the way that society is structured. I don't think anyone is going to propose taking away the pub from the average Brit. If they are, they're a brave person.
Yeah, I mean, they have taken it away since March, though, obviously, because all the ones around here are still shut. Obviously, there are plans to reopen at some point but they're planning to put restrictions on, say, people getting drunk. So you're going to forget about socially distancing then, aren't you? That sort of thing. So, that's the new normal, so to speak.
The one thing that I can say about alcohol sales during lockdown in the UK is they went up 280%.
Yes, for in your house. Yes, they did. In fact, I've seen people. I'm stood as I'm here. I'm opposite an off license and seeing people taking out big boxes of what. It's obvious what's in the big boxes, what they're taking out, and why they're still doing it in this weekend in June. Obviously, why more people seem to be doing it compared to last year's June.
Because it's the cultural whiplash. It's not just the pubs are shut. I think even when the pubs reopen, there is going to be, by some people, some hesitancy to be around others.
Yes.
Especially those with vulnerable. It is going to be an extra consideration.
But am I going to pick it up? Yes, but in a year or two's time, maybe a year's time, surely this will start to slide away and people will not be worried to be with other people, strangers in a cinema or the restaurant, or it's got to go, hasn't it? Well, we returned to normal from 1918 to the 20s, didn't we? That went in time. This is no different.
But the effects of Spanish flu also were positive changes in society, yes. Ultimately.
So which I hope for here.
People the generation of those who were brought up around the vast numbers of dead from war and from illness, helped found the NHS.
Yes, that finally got created in 1948. But these big positive changes in societies often do follow war. We saw the creation of the welfare state and the NHS and the landslide election of the Labour government in 1945 of Clement Attlee, when perhaps people would have thought Winston Churchill would be put in the immediate election after the war, but that didn't happen.
Well, these changes don't have to occur by war. I mean, I have said before, really, does it take millions, tens of millions of people to die before we look at each other and care? If that's the case, that's a damning indictment on our species.
It's a similar situation now. It's kind of a war situation, isn't it? Great adversity being battled, and as you said, some of the changes are going to be positive, because of the change in how people are exploited through work, for example. We won't be able to simply go back to the way it was. So, and making provisions for people to still be able to have money and a place in society.
Well, the positive changes might be that airlines don't cram everyone in like sardines in a tin. Cinemas don't do the same. That there are sensible options, that it's not just profit at all costs, that we start, voting with our feet. I don't know. There could be a lot of things, but I'll tell you one thing, folks. This isn't going to be done by September.
Oh no, well, maybe not. No, obviously, I mean that's. But with the likes of EasyJet and so on, not being able to make a profit or cram people onto a plane where the in-flight meal is done in a trough, would have the negative effect of nobody being able to hardly afford, ordinary people not being able to afford a flight because it becomes unaffordable when you can't get those cheap airlines. That wouldn't seem so positive, however, even if you weren't crammed on like sardines on your 18 to 30 trip to Ibiza.
Well, as a trade unionist, I would be saying, is it cheap flights we want, or is it better pay?
Because obviously things that are cheap come at a cost, and therefore how everybody, employees, what the deal they've got with those cheap airlines, etc. We've had Richard Branson wanting to get bailed out by the government, so
I completely agree with that. Let's nationalise Virgin.
That's what we could be looking at. Obviously, we could be looking at flights becoming less, only affordable to people with more wealth, and maybe that would set back progress. You wouldn't be able to take a holiday in Spain. It's already difficult to do on benefits, but you wouldn't be able to do it from the perspective of having a typical sort of job. Or something like that. You'd have to holiday within the United Kingdom.
I have a feeling Brexit is going to make sure that people do that anyway.
So there's that. Just before to the end as well, which is the do you think that the powers that be in the world, when it takes you into conspiracy theory, unfortunately, because of this reduction in lifestyles, the shrinking of the economy, is it do they want to limit the scope of ordinary people, do you think? Do you think they want to, perhaps they know that oil is not going to last forever, and they want to actually have something that will limit the scope of people to travel, to take planes, and perhaps they're concerned about the population. They're finding ways to reduce it. These are all just theories. Do you think there's anything in that sort of thinking?
Not necessarily. What I do think is that the deliberate. We don't have in the West, still in France and across the continent, but US, UK, Canada, Australia, for that matter. There used to be large amounts of political education. I'm not on about political parties. I'm on about even social education, how to run a household, discussing issues of the day, current affairs, that kind of stuff. That was permitted, and debate and discourse was permitted. Now we have I think there's an absolute desire to make sure that people know their place, and for staggering reasons that can only be explained that the UK and US populations are sadomasochists. They keep voting in Republicans, and I'm not about the president, by the way, who didn't win a majority, but certainly in state legislatures in the US and in the UK, there is no critique of the media. There is no criticism, healthy criticism and discussion of government or political parties. Instead, we jump to the extremes of this guy's a terrorist, this guy's your bumbling, idiotic friend. Regrettably, what that does is it means that decisions that are ultimately not in our own interests are made, and we all have to deal with the consequences. And when we start to question what the consequences are, we're distracted by a royal baby, a royal divorce, a royal split up, a royal we're not royals anymore. The prime minister's pregnant. The prime minister's slept with this person. Some sort of distraction, just to the point where people begin to question why it is we're in such dire times.
Well, the prime minister getting coronavirus, but but also you know what the term is, don't you? In ancient Rome, bread and circuses. Even the return of the Premier League, the football, to be concerned whether Liverpool's going to win the league or not, and then have to do the whole campaign again the next season, and just all starts all over again. All talent shows, Britain's Got Talent, the X Factor, the soaps. It's all bread and circuses.
Well, it is bread and circuses, and as many greats have commented, that bread and circuses works in the sixth stage of empire, gluttony. However, it almost certainly precipitates the seventh stage, which is collapse.
Wow. Don't even know what
And
the first five stages are, but yes, but you assume
oh,
that we're already at a late stage of this capitalist empire, so to speak.
yeah, and like I say, the lack of political knowledge, the ability to critically think, and all of this, they are the reasons why, for a lot of British people, they will be no longer able to go to Spain or to Italy or wherever it is in Europe because Brexit has meant they can't. And I don't mean the countries won't welcome them. I'm sure, well, I'd hope they do. Um, the reason I say this is because you've got the double whammy. I mean, the worst case scenario would be a really bad second wave and a no deal Brexit, which for me I think is coming anyway. If you want to feel isolated, well, locked down and stuck in your house, wait until the entire country has severed its relations with its closest partners. Wait until there's a border again with Northern Ireland and the Republic, this time in the middle of the sea. Wait until Scotland starts demanding its independence. These are consequences that to decisions that we have made whilst distracted by looking at the flag and remembering Churchill without actually looking at the reality behind the situation.
And you're in France. You've been able to move to France, haven't you? Which is, so you've been stuck for a while, so you've had some fairly dire consequences of the lockdown, stuck in a place with most of your possessions moved out, and while still having to be in lockdown where you were in the UK. Has it eased somewhat in France? Just to finish on that, is it a bit more relaxed than it? I know France was stricter than the UK at one point. I know it's got these traffic light zones now about local restrictions and things depending on the area you're on. How is it in France now?
Yeah, people are still going out for people are now going out for coffee and cigarette. If you try and take those two away from the French, you're in trouble.
Oh, yeah.
But the cafe table and chairs are noticeably distant from each other. My favourite, I say my favourite, it's not, but don't tell them. The local coffee shop around the corner, you can't go into the shop, the toilet's shut, but they will come out, serve you coffee, and all of that. And by closing the toilets, because a lot of their customers are from the immediate area, it's forcing them to go back home. Supermarkets, yes, though, fully stocked, shelved, lots of variety of things, no queuing, straight in.
We're getting queuing now. We're still getting it in the middle of the day. We're getting it in most supermarkets. So it's amazing to hear that that's how far they've moved on.
Yeah, there's never really any panic buying. But to be honest with you, the one comment I would make is people are still tending to stay indoors.
Yeah, so they're following
villages
that.
And towns are very quiet.
So, and in England, we're maybe not seeing that as much. Some people are deciding to do that, obviously, but we are seeing a lot of people out. There's a lot of traffic. There's a lot going on. So you're seeing less of that in France, even though...
No, much less.
So it's permitted, though,
less.
isn't it? It's their own decision. Could you drive to Paris now, for example? Would there be any... is that stopped?
I could drive to Paris. If I did, I'd hope that you'd stop me and question what on earth I'm doing. And that's nothing to do with the lockdown.
No, I know. But is this freedom to travel within France? Is it starting to come back? Can you do that?
Yeah, to travel to the Ile-de-France, which is in essence the area around Paris, there are restrictions on travel, on public transport. And there are some restrictions still on driving. If I wanted to go to anywhere else, yes, that would be absolutely fine.
So really, it's almost lifted, and you had to travel through the UK though. You'll obviously have done it before. And what did you notice that being considerably more difficult to do because of this?
No.
So there weren't any problems. I suppose because lockdown was, quite eased in England. But what about at the airport? Were they checking if you had the virus or anything like that? Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you didn't use the airport. So I've asked you about that. I don't even know how you got there.
No,
So Ashley ran out of space at the end, but all he said at the end is that it was pretty normal travelling through France and everything else, except for being asked why he was going there, through the ferry. So obviously that means that, in some ways we're almost out of some of the worst restrictions of the lockdown, because previously it would have been very difficult to take a trip to move into France from the UK. I apologise for some gaps within the recording that we've had due to the lack of space on the system to record something as long as 2 hours. So that was the insights of J. Martin on our world. Society and politics. The J. Martin interview.